I was 39 years old when my father told me I could attend my brother's engagement dinner, but only if I agreed to arrive like a stranger and leave like one too. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten me. He said it in the same tone people use to discuss seating cards or wine pairings. My brother's future in-laws were federal judges, he reminded me. Important people, refined people. And if anyone asked, I was not to say I was his sister. I was to keep things simple, sit in the back, smile politely, 'cause no confusion. What none of them understood was that the man they were so desperate to impress would know exactly who I was the second he saw my face. My name is Eleanor Whitman, though almost everyone who mattered in my adult life called me Nora. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I had learned long ago that humiliation is often delivered in the gentlest voice. It rarely arrives looking violent. More often it comes dressed as practicality, as discretion, as family harmony. The ugliest things people do are usually the ones they can explain in complete sentences without ever once sounding cruel. My father proved that on a Tuesday evening while I was still at my desk. The office had gone mostly quiet by then. There was a low hum from the vent overhead, the smell of stale coffee somewhere down the hall, and a stack of briefing folders waiting for me to review before morning. I remember the exact shape of the light on the desk when my phone lit up. My brother Daniel's name appeared first. For one second I assumed it was some ordinary update about the dinner, a change in time, a request to bring something, another of those small family instructions that always seemed to find me at the end of a long day when my defenses were thinner than they should have been. I opened the message and read it once. Then I read it again. Hey, just keeping this easy for Friday. Emily's parents are both federal judges, and Dad thinks it would be better if we don't get into the whole family dynamic. So please don't mention you're my sister unless it somehow comes up directly. No need to make the night awkward. They've got a small table in the back for a few extra guests. Appreciate you understanding. There are insults so cleanly phrased they do not feel real at first. They feel edited, rehearsed, like something discussed by multiple people before it was handed to you. I stared at the screen until it dimmed in my hand. Then, as if the timing had been arranged, my phone rang. It was my mother. I almost let it go to voicemail, but that would only have delayed what I already knew was coming. I answered and leaned back in my chair, looking through the narrow office window at the dark parking lot outside. "Honey," she said in that careful voice she used when she wanted me to accept something ugly without making it inconvenient for anyone else. "Did Daniel text you?" "Yes." There was a pause. Soft, measured. "I just don't want you to take it the wrong way." That was her gift. Not defending the wound, managing my reaction to it. "How should I take it?" I asked. She ignored the question. "This dinner is important to him, Nora. Emily's family is very distinguished. Her father is on the federal bench, her mother as well, and everything is going to be very formal. Your father just thinks it would be better if there weren't unnecessary complications." I looked down at the file open in front of me, but the words had stopped meaning anything. "Unnecessary complications," I repeated. "You know what I mean." I did. That was the problem. In my family, no one needed to say the cruel part out loud. They simply arranged the furniture around it and expected you to understand where you belonged. She kept talking. "They've already finalized the seating. There's a smaller table toward the back near the service entrance. It's actually quieter there. You might prefer it." Quieter. That was how they always translated exclusion into manners. Quieter meant hidden. Simpler meant diminished. Better meant easier for everyone except me. "And what exactly am I supposed to say if someone asks who I am?" I said. Another pause. Then almost briskly, "You don't have to volunteer anything. You can just say you work with the Army." "Work with the Army. Not serve, not officer, not captain, certainly not daughter." I closed my eyes for a second. I could feel the old familiar pressure settling in behind my ribs, that dense, airless feeling I had known since childhood. Daniel got the spotlight. I got the explanation. He was introduced with pride. I was managed, softened, edited down into whatever version of myself created the least tension in a room. "Dad asked you to call me, didn't he?" I said. My mother exhaled quietly. "He just wants this evening to go smoothly." "For whom?" She did not answer. That silence told me more than anything else could have. After we hung up, I sat alone for several minutes with my phone face down on the desk. I could hear footsteps in the hall, then laughter from somewhere farther off, then the metallic slam of a door. The building kept moving around me while something old and familiar settled into place. Because Daniel's message had not come out of nowhere. It came from a lifetime of being treated like the part of the family story that never fit the polished version they wanted to tell in public. Daniel had always been the one people remembered. He had the easy confidence of a man raised to believe rooms would open for him. My parents built their lives around that confidence. They invested in it, protected it, repeated it until it sounded like truth. He was the bright one, the social one, the promising one, the son with the right kind of ambition. I took a different road, and from the beginning they treated it like a detour from something more acceptable. When I joined the army, my father called it impulsive, then temporary, then unfortunate. Even after years of service, after promotions, after evaluations and responsibilities and deployments, he never fully bothered to understand. He still spoke about my life as if it were a phase that had somehow lasted too long. In his mind, Daniel had entered the world properly. I had merely wandered into a version of adulthood that made people ask questions at dinner parties. I should say this clearly: my family did not dislike failure. Failure they would have known how to handle. Failure would have made me legible to them. What unsettled them was competence they had not arranged, discipline they had not paid for, respect I had earned in rooms where their approval meant nothing. I picked up the phone again and read Daniel's message one more time. It was the phrase, "appreciate you understanding," that stayed with me. As if obedience were courtesy. As if my silence were a contribution to his happiness. As if I had spent 39 years in this family for the privilege of making myself smaller on command. Outside, the last stripe of daylight had disappeared. My reflection in the window looked older than I felt, sharper too. Tired in the way that comes not from work, but from repetition. From being asked again and again to carry other people's comfort at the expense of your own dignity. And still, after all that, I knew I was going to go. Not because they deserved my presence, not because I believed kindness would finally teach them something, but because somewhere beneath the humiliation, beneath the anger, beneath the old and familiar ache of being reduced, there was another feeling beginning to take shape. Colder, clearer. The sort of clarity that arrives when a person finally understands that helping people lie about you is still a form of surrender. I did not answer Daniel that night. I did not call my father back. I simply sat there in the dim office with the stack of papers untouched in front of me and let the truth settle all the way in. They wanted me present but not acknowledged, close enough to count, far enough away to deny. What none of them understood was that the very man they were trying so hard to impress had every reason to know my name. And once I realized that, the whole shape of Friday evening began to change. For the first few minutes after my mother hung up, I did not move. I simply sat there in the half-lit office and let the silence settle. The building had that late evening stillness you only notice when most people have already gone home. Somewhere down the hallway, a copier clicked to life and then stopped again. A door opened shut and the sound faded away. The world kept moving in small mechanical ways while my family's message sat in my pocket like something sharp. It would be easy to pretend that Daniel's text had shocked me. It would make the story cleaner. But the truth is uglier and more familiar. What he asked of me that night was not new. It was simply the most honest version of a pattern that had been quietly shaping our family for years. Daniel had always been the son my parents could introduce without explanation. He was charming in the effortless way some people are when they have spent their entire lives being admired for it. Teachers liked him, coaches liked him, parents of other children liked him. He learned early that a confident smile and the right joke could open almost any door, and my parents built their hopes around that gift the way some families build around inheritance. When he got into a prestigious university, my father talked about it for months. Not privately either. He told the neighbors. He told the man who serviced our furnace. He told strangers at church who had not asked. It was as if Daniel's acceptance letter had finally proven something about the Whitman name that my father had been waiting his whole life to demonstrate. I remember the night of that celebration dinner very clearly. I was 19. I had just signed my enlistment papers 2 weeks earlier, though my parents were still pretending the decision might somehow evaporate if they ignored it long enough. Daniel stood at the head of the table, while my father raised a glass and described his future in glowing terms: law school influence connections, a career that would place our family in the right circles. Then he turned to me. He did not insult me, that would have been too crude. Instead, he gave a small laugh and said, "Nora has always been a little more independent." Independent. That was the word he used every time he wanted to acknowledge my existence without endorsing it. By the time I joined the army officially, that language had hardened into something almost ritualistic. My parents would explain me to new acquaintances the same way every time. "Our daughter works with the military." Not serves, not leads, not commands. Works with. The distinction mattered to them. Service sounded too serious, too permanent, too different from the professional trajectories they understood. Works with the military suggested something temporary and administrative, something that could still fit neatly into the story they preferred. Over time, I stopped correcting them. Partly because arguing never changed anything, but mostly because my real life existed in a world that had nothing to do with their approval. In the army, people did not care whether your father liked your career choices. They cared whether you could be trusted, whether you showed up when things got difficult, whether the people under your command felt safer because you were standing there instead of someone else. Respect in that environment had a very different texture. It was quieter, harder, real. That was where I built my life. And for a long time, that separation made things easier. My family stayed in their orbit of charity galas and professional networking dinners, while I moved through a completely different system of responsibility and consequence. When we saw each other on holidays, the conversations stayed shallow enough that everyone could pretend the distance was simply logistical. But Daniel's engagement had changed something. Emily Carter came from exactly the kind of family my father had always admired from a distance. Both her parents sat on the federal bench. Her mother had served as a respected prosecutor before her appointment. Her father, Judge Benjamin Carter, had built a reputation that extended well beyond the courtroom. Articles had been written about him. Law schools invited him to speak. His name appeared in the kind of publications my father read carefully and quoted often. When Daniel first mentioned the relationship, my mother sounded almost giddy. "They're such an accomplished family," she said over the phone one Sunday afternoon. "Your father is very impressed." I remember standing on the balcony outside my apartment that day, watching a helicopter pass low over the river, while she talked about Emily's background like it was a rare antique Daniel had somehow managed to acquire. I asked one simple question. "Does Emily know about me?" My mother hesitated. "Well, Daniel hasn't really gotten into the details yet." Of course he hadn't. In the weeks that followed, the pattern became obvious. My parents spoke about Emily's family constantly, where they lived, what law schools they had attended, which judges they knew personally. They repeated these details the way people repeat a new title they are trying to memorize. What they did not repeat was anything about me. And now here we were 3 nights before the engagement dinner with Daniel, asking me to arrive like a stranger, so his future in-laws would not have to reconcile the image of their polished son-in-law with the inconvenient reality of his sister. I left the office later than usual that evening. The parking lot had emptied out except for a few scattered vehicles under the yellow security lights. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the pavement still held the warmth of the day. When I reached my car, I sat behind the wheel for a minute before starting the engine. The phone in my hand felt heavier than it should have. There was one person I knew I could call. Colonel Diane Mercer had been my commanding officer during one of the most demanding stretches of my career. She had the rare ability to evaluate people without flinching, and the even rarer habit of saying exactly what she thought without softening it to protect anyone's ego. Over the years, she had become something closer to a mentor than a superior. If anyone could hear this story without immediately trying to soothe it into something smaller, it was her. She answered on the second ring. "Mercer." "Ma'am, it's Nora Whitman." "Whitman," she said, her voice warming slightly. "You sound tired." "I just received an interesting family invitation." That got her attention. Interesting how? I told her everything. Daniel's message, my mother's call, the seating arrangement, the quiet insistence that I should help them keep things simple. She did not interrupt while I spoke. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. Then she asked one question. What did you say the father's name was? Judge Benjamin Carter. Another pause, this one longer. When she spoke again, there was a faint note of disbelief in her voice. Whitman, she said slowly, does your family have any idea who you are? I leaned my head back against the seat and looked up through the windshield at the dark sky. No, I said. They don't. Colonel Mercer exhaled softly. Well, she said that dinner might be more educational than they expect. Colonel Mercer did not laugh after she said that. That was one of the things I had always respected about her. Some people treat uncomfortable truths like opportunities for humor. Mercer treated them like coordinates, something to mark on a map before you decided what direction to take next. For a moment the line stayed quiet except for the faint rustle of movement on her end. Then she said, Tell me something, Whitman. Are you planning to go? Yes. There was no hesitation in my voice when I answered, and I noticed it the moment the word left my mouth. That decision had already been made somewhere deeper than anger. Mercer heard it too. Good, she said simply. That's it. No advice about avoiding family drama. You're 39 years old and a United States Army officer, she replied. If you need me to tell you how to behave at dinner, we've both wasted a lot of time. Despite myself, I smiled. She continued in that dry, matter-of-fact tone that had carried half a dozen officers through situations far more complicated than awkward social events. Your brother is about to marry into a family that takes character seriously, she said. People like Judge Carter didn't build reputations by being easily impressed. I don't want to embarrass anyone, I said. That may not be entirely within your control. I leaned forward over the steering wheel, resting my elbows there while the cool leather pressed against my arms. The parking lot was empty now except for my car and one security truck idling near the gate. You sounded surprised when you heard his name, I said. Mercer gave a small hum of acknowledgement. Judge Carter spoke at a legal military symposium 2 years ago, she explained. National security oversight. Civilian courts reviewing operational conduct. You weren't in the room when he arrived, but I remember the panel discussion afterward. What about it? He quoted you. That made me sit up. Excuse me. He referenced a field assessment you submitted during the coastal evacuation operation, the one about command accountability during civilian coordination. I stared out across the dark asphalt. That memo wasn't even public. It circulated, Mercer said calmly, in the right circles. For a moment I said nothing. That report had been written at 3 a.m. in a temporary operations center while half the coastline was still underwater. I had not written it to impress anyone. I had written it because the chaos we had seen demanded a clear accounting of what worked and what did not. I had assumed it disappeared into a government archive like most documents of that kind. Mercer continued. Carter used it as an example of clear operational reasoning, she said. He told a room full of lawyers that if they wanted to understand how disciplined thinking looks under pressure, they should start with that report. The words settled slowly. You're telling me he knows my name? I'm telling you he recognized it 2 years ago, she replied, which means if he sees you Friday night, he won't be confused about who you are. I exhaled quietly through my nose. Daniel is going to hate that. That's Daniel's problem. The calm certainty in her voice felt like solid ground under my feet. What would you do? I asked. Mercer did not answer right away. Finally, she said, if it were me, I would go exactly as invited. You mean sit quietly at the back? Yes. And say nothing? Yes. Why? Because people reveal themselves fastest when they believe you are powerless, she said. Let them finish their performance. That phrase stayed with me long after the call ended. Let them finish their performance. I drove home slowly that night through quiet streets that smelled faintly of wet pavement and autumn leaves. My apartment building sat on a corner where the city lights reflected off the river, and when I stepped out of the car, the air felt sharp enough to wake every nerve in my face. Inside the place was exactly the way I had left it that morning. A stack of books on the coffee table, running shoes by the door, the faint ticking sound from the old wall clock in the kitchen. There is a particular kind of peace in living alone that most people misunderstand. It is not loneliness. It is the absence of explanation. No one asking where you've been. No one deciding whether your choices make sense. I poured a glass of water and stood by the window looking down at the dark water moving below the bridge. My family had spent years treating my life like a puzzle piece that did not match the picture they wanted to display. Daniel fit that picture perfectly. He wore the right suits, said the right things, and navigated rooms filled with polished strangers as if he had been born in them. I navigated different rooms. Rooms where rank mattered more than reputation. Rooms where the wrong decision could cost lives instead of social embarrassment. Rooms where the people around you did not care what your parents thought about your career choices. I had never asked my family to understand that world, but I had not expected to be hidden from it either. Friday evening arrived faster than I expected. The days leading up to it passed in a blur of routine tasks, meetings, and briefings, but beneath the ordinary rhythm of work, there was a quiet sense of anticipation building inside me. Not the nervous kind, something steadier. By the time I left the office that afternoon, the sky over the city had turned the pale gray blue of early winter. The air carried that dry cold that sharpens every sound, and the sidewalks were crowded with people hurrying toward restaurants and theaters as the workday ended. I went home showered and stood in front of my closet for a long moment. There was a perfectly pressed dress uniform hanging there. The metals caught the light when I moved the hanger slightly, each small ribbon representing a piece of time that had nothing to do with my family's expectations. For a second I considered wearing it. Then I remembered Daniel's message. Keep things simple. I chose a black dress instead. Clean lines, nothing flashy, understated heels, the sort of quiet elegance that disappears easily into a room full of expensive people. When I finished getting ready, I looked at myself in the mirror by the door. There was no trace of the 19-year-old girl who had sat through that college acceptance dinner years earlier, while her father described her future like an unfortunate detour. The woman looking back at me had lines at the corners of her eyes from years spent squinting into bright sun and strong wind. Her shoulders were straighter, too shaped by responsibilities that did not allow room for self-doubt. The doorbell rang just after 6. When I opened it, Colonel Mercer stood there in a dark coat, her silver hair pulled back neatly the way it always had been when she wore a uniform. "You clean up well, Whitman," she said. "You're not even slightly surprised." "Not even slightly." We walked down to the car together. The drive into the city was quiet at first, the streetlights sliding across the windshield as traffic moved steadily toward downtown. Finally, Mercer glanced at me from the driver's seat. "You nervous?" "Number." "Good." She turned the car onto a wide avenue lined with old brick buildings and private clubs that had been standing there longer than most people could remember. "You know," she said casually, "there's a certain advantage to being underestimated." I looked out the window at the rows of tall windows glowing warmly against the dark. "What's that?" Mercer gave a small, knowing smile. "No one prepares for you." 10 minutes later, we turned into the circular driveway of the Union Harbor Club, where my family was already inside waiting to explain who I wasn't. The Union Harbor Club was exactly the kind of place my father admired. Old brick-polished brass, and a quiet confidence that suggested money had been moving through those rooms for longer than anyone needed to mention. The building sat on the edge of the harbor, its tall windows reflecting the dark water beyond the streetlights. When Mercer pulled the car under the front awning, a doorman in a navy coat stepped forward with the practiced ease of someone who had opened thousands of doors without ever appearing rushed. I stepped out into the cold air and looked up at the building for a moment. Inside, somewhere beyond those tall windows, my family was preparing to pretend I did not belong to them. Mercer joined me on the sidewalk, adjusting her coat with that same calm precision she had once used to straighten the collar of her uniform before walking into a command briefing. "You ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for years." She studied my face for a second, then nodded toward the entrance. "Let them talk first." The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and citrus cleaner. Thick rugs softened every step, and the walls were lined with framed photographs of men in dark suits, shaking hands with other men in dark suits. Power had passed through those hallways in quiet, respectable ways for generations. A host greeted us and asked for the name. "Whitman," I said. The reaction was immediate. A small flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by the polite smile that accompanies important reservations. "Of course," he said. "The Whitman party is in the private dining room." He led us down a narrow corridor where the muffled sound of conversation grew louder with each step. Laughter drifted through the door ahead, along with the soft clink of glassware and silverware against porcelain. Before we entered, Mercer placed a hand lightly on my arm. "Remember," she said quietly, "silence can be very educational." Then the host opened the door. The room was larger than I expected, with tall windows overlooking the harbor, and dark wood paneling that gave the entire space the weight of tradition. Round tables were arranged in careful symmetry beneath warm overhead lights. Every place setting gleamed. Every chair was perfectly aligned. And at the center of it all stood my brother. Daniel looked exactly the way my parents had always imagined he would at an event like this. His suit fit perfectly. His hair was trimmed with the careful attention of someone who had spent the afternoon in a good barber's chair, and the confident smile on his face was already directed toward the people whose approval mattered most to him. Beside him stood Emily Carter. She was elegant in the quiet way that comes from a lifetime of being comfortable in formal rooms. Her dress was simple but expensive, and she carried herself with the poised calm of someone raised among people who expected to be listened to. When she laughed at something, my father said the sound carried easily across the room. My parents stood near them both. My mother's smile was stretched just a little too wide, the way it always was when she wanted everything to look perfect at once. My father had one hand resting lightly against the back of Daniel's chair, as if claiming a small piece of the moment for himself. They had not noticed me yet. For a few seconds, Mercer and I stood quietly near the entrance, watching the room the same way you watch a stage before the actors realize the audience has arrived. Then Daniel turned. The color drained from his face so quickly it would have been funny in another context. He recovered almost immediately, of course. Daniel had spent his entire life learning how to correct a misstep before anyone else could see it. He crossed the room toward us with quick, controlled steps, his smile already back in place by the time he reached us. "You made it," he said under his breath. I said I would. His eyes flicked briefly to Mercer. "And you brought—" "Colonel Diane Mercer," she said, extending a hand before he could finish the question. "Retired." Daniel shook it automatically, though I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He did not recognize her, but he recognized the weight of the title. "Of course," he said. "Welcome." He turned back to me, lowering his voice even further. "You're a little early." "I'm on time." His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. "Well," he said, forcing a small laugh, "we're still getting everyone settled. Let's just keep things simple tonight, okay?" The word landed exactly the way it had in his message. Simple. Before I could respond, Emily appeared beside him, graceful and composed. "Daniel," she said warmly, "aren't you going to introduce me?" He hesitated. The moment was brief, no longer than the pause between breaths, but I felt it clearly. A tiny calculation about how to present me. "This is Nora," he said finally. "She works with the army."
Works with.
The phrase hung in the air between us. Emily smiled politely and extended her hand. "It's lovely to meet you." "Likewise," I said. Her grip was firm and warm. She had no idea she had just been introduced to the one person in the room her fiancé was most eager to keep invisible. My mother approached next. "Nora," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "We're so glad you could make it." Her eyes moved quickly across my dress, my hair, my posture, checking for anything that might attract attention. Apparently satisfied, she lowered her voice. "We saved you a seat in the back," she added. "It's quieter there." Quieter. I followed her gaze across the room. Near the far wall, beside a narrow door used by the serving staff, stood a small table with only 3 chairs. It was slightly removed from the rest of the arrangement, just far enough away that conversations from the main table would reach it as a distant murmur. Out of sight. Out of the story. "Perfect," I said. My father joined us then. He did not hug me. He simply nodded, once his expression calm and controlled. "Good of you to come," he said. There was no apology in his voice, no acknowledgement of the message that had been sent days earlier. Just expectation. As if my compliance had always been inevitable. A server approached with a tray of champagne flutes, offering them to the guests near the entrance. Mercer accepted one, though I noticed she did not drink from it. Daniel glanced again toward the back table. "You'll be comfortable there," he said. "It's quieter." I held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "I'm sure it is." Mercer and I crossed the room together. As I sat down at the small table near the service door, I folded my hands lightly in my lap and looked out across the dining room. From this angle I could see everything: my brother's careful laughter, my father's eager posture, my mother's watchful eyes scanning the faces of the Carters for approval. And at the center of it all, seated beside Emily, was the man they had spent weeks trying to impress. Judge Benjamin Carter. He was older than I expected, with silver hair and the quiet stillness of someone accustomed to being listened to without raising his voice. While the rest of the table spoke animatedly, he said little. He simply observed. Then a few minutes later he stood. One of the servers handed him a tray of champagne flutes, and he began making his way around the room the way hosts sometimes do in formal gatherings, offering drinks personally to each table before the meal began. My brother watched him with open admiration. To Daniel, this small gesture was already becoming a story he would repeat for years. The night the distinguished judge personally welcomed him into the family, Judge Carter moved from table to table, exchanging polite greetings, shaking hands, listening more than he spoke. Then gradually his path turned toward the back of the room. Toward my table. Toward the service door. Toward the quiet corner where my family had decided it would be safest for me to sit. From where I sat, I could watch Judge Carter move slowly across the room. He carried the tray of champagne with the ease of someone accustomed to hosting formal gatherings. Each stop along the way was brief, an exchange of a few polite words, a quiet laugh, the soft clink of glass as someone accepted a drink. He listened more than he spoke, and people leaned slightly toward him when they did, as if the center of gravity in the room shifted in whatever direction he happened to face. My brother followed him with his eyes like a man watching the future walk around the room. I could almost hear the story Daniel was already preparing to tell later. The night Judge Benjamin Carter personally welcomed him into the family, the way the great man had paused at their table, the way he had spoken to him like an equal. The thing about ambition is that it rarely sees the whole room. Mercer sat across from me, one elbow resting lightly on the table. She had not touched the champagne glass in her hand. "You see him?" she murmured quietly. "Yes. Watch his eyes." I did. Judge Carter's gaze moved carefully across the tables as he made his way toward the back. It was not the distracted scanning of someone performing a social duty. It was measured, curious, observant in a way that suggested he was taking notes no one else could see. At the main table, my father was speaking animatedly to Emily's mother, his voice rising just enough to carry. Daniel laughed at something Emily said, a little louder than necessary. My mother leaned forward attentively, as though the entire evening depended on her ability to maintain the right tone of conversation. None of them were looking in my direction. That had been the point. By the time Judge Carter reached the final row of tables, only one stop remained. Mine. I could hear the faint hum of the service corridor behind me. The door opened briefly as a waiter stepped through carrying a tray of bread baskets, then closed again with a soft click. Judge Carter turned the last few steps toward my table. From the main table, Daniel's attention had shifted elsewhere. My parents were focused entirely on their conversation with Emily's mother. To them, I was exactly where they had intended me to be. Quiet. Out of the way. Safe. Judge Carter stopped beside my chair. For a moment, he simply looked down at the tray, adjusting the position of the glasses slightly, as if preparing to offer them. Then he lifted his eyes. It took less than a second. I watched the recognition arrive in his expression like the sudden change in weather before a storm. His entire posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough that the tray in his hands tilted slightly, and two champagne flutes tapped together with a clear, bright sound. He stared at me. Not with confusion. Not with the polite uncertainty of someone trying to place a face. With unmistakable recognition. The tray lowered slowly to the corner of my table. And then he straightened. When he spoke, his voice carried farther than he probably intended. "Ma'am, Captain Whitman." The room changed instantly. It was not loud. No one gasped, no one shouted. But conversation across the dining room faltered in the subtle way that trained social spaces always do when something unexpected happens. Heads turned gradually, then more quickly as the silence spread. I stood automatically. Military habit. Respect offered to someone who had addressed me directly. Judge Carter reached out and shook my hand with both of his. "I did not realize you were here tonight," he said. His tone was warm, almost surprised. "It's an honor to see you again." By then, every face at the main table had turned toward us. My brother's expression froze first. Then my mother's smile faltered. My father rose halfway out of his chair before he seemed to remember himself and stopped. Emily looked from me to her father with open confusion. I could feel the attention of the entire room settling in our direction. "I'm glad to see you again as well, sir," I said evenly. Judge Carter studied my face with the thoughtful calm of a man confirming something he had already suspected. "I quoted your coastal evacuation report during a symposium in Washington," he said. "One of the clearest analyses of command responsibility I've read in years." At the main table, my father blinked. My brother looked as though someone had suddenly rearranged the floor beneath his feet. "I wasn't aware it had circulated that widely," I replied. "Oh, it circulated," Carter said with a faint smile. "Two of my clerks still argue about one of your conclusions." He turned slightly toward Mercer. "And you must be Colonel Mercer." Mercer stood smoothly beside me. "Retired, Your Honor." "Of course," he said. "Your reputation precedes you as well." Across the room, Daniel was no longer smiling. My mother rose from her chair and hurried toward us, her heels clicking quickly against the polished floor. "Oh," she said lightly, the word arriving half a second too late. "You've already met Nora." Judge Carter glanced toward her, polite but unmoved. "Yes," he said, "we have." My father followed more slowly, his expression tightening with every step. Emily came with them, her confusion now sharpened into curiosity. "This is Captain Whitman Carter," continued calmly, gesturing toward me. "One of the most disciplined operational thinkers I've encountered in recent years." The sentence landed like a stone in still water. Captain. Operational. Thinker. None of those words existed anywhere in the introduction my brother had offered earlier. My mother gave a small, nervous laugh. "Nora has always been modest about her work," she said quickly. Carter's attention returned to me. "That may be," he said. Then his eyes moved past me toward the empty chairs at my table, and his expression changed. He looked around the room once more, slowly taking in the arrangement of guests, the central table where my brother sat, the distance between that table and the quiet corner near the service door. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but it carried clearly across the room. "Why," he asked, "is Captain Whitman seated back here?" No one answered immediately. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "There must have been some confusion with the seating," he said. It was the wrong sentence. Not because it was a lie, but because it revealed something much worse. Judge Carter looked at him carefully, then at my father, then back at me. And in that moment I saw something shift behind his eyes, the quiet calculation of a man who had spent his entire career recognizing the difference between coincidence and intention. For a moment no one spoke. The silence that settled over the room was not chaotic. It was controlled, almost professional, the kind that spreads through formal spaces, when people sense that something important is unfolding and instinctively step back to watch it happen. Judge Carter remained seated at my table. That decision alone changed the entire balance of the evening. He did not return to the main table where his daughter and future son-in-law waited. He did not treat our brief exchange as a pleasant coincidence before moving on to the rest of the room. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down as if he had every reason in the world to be exactly where he was. The tray of champagne still rested untouched on the corner of the table. From the corner of my eye, I saw my brother's posture stiffen. Daniel had spent his whole life understanding rooms, reading them, controlling them. But this room was no longer moving according to his script. Judge Carter rested one hand lightly on the table. "I asked a simple question," he said calmly. His voice was not loud, but every word landed with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being answered. "Why is Captain Whitman seated back here?" My father cleared his throat. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said. "The seating was arranged quickly and—" Colonel Mercer stepped forward before he could finish. "With respect," she said, "the seating appears very intentional." The room shifted again. My mother's eyes flashed briefly toward Mercer, irritation flickering behind the polite smile she had been trying to maintain all evening. Judge Carter turned toward her. "Mrs. Whitman," he said gently, "did you arrange the seating?" She hesitated. That hesitation was small. But in a room full of observant people, it might as well have been a confession. "We simply wanted the evening to go smoothly," she said finally. The phrase sounded familiar. I had heard it earlier in the week from her over the phone. Judge Carter considered that answer for a moment. "Smoothly," he repeated. Then his attention shifted to my brother. Daniel stood near the main table, one hand gripping the back of a chair as if it were the only solid object left in the room. "It's really nothing," he said quickly. "Nora doesn't care where she sits. She prefers quieter spaces anyway." There it was. The same sentence my mother had offered earlier. The same translation of exclusion into courtesy. Judge Carter's eyes sharpened slightly. "I see," he said. Mercer reached into her coat pocket. I noticed the movement immediately. She took out her phone and glanced at me once. It was not a request for permission. It was a courtesy. A small acknowledgement that what came next would change the evening permanently. I did not stop her. Mercer turned the screen toward Judge Carter. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "I believe the seating decision may have been discussed in advance." Judge Carter accepted the phone. He adjusted his glasses slightly and began to read. The room remained completely silent. Across the table from us, my father's shoulders tensed. My mother's hands tightened together. Daniel took one step forward. "Colonel, that really isn't necessary," he said quickly. Judge Carter held up one hand without looking up. The gesture stopped him immediately. When Carter finished reading, he did something interesting. He read the message again. Slowly. Carefully. Then he placed the phone on the table between us. "What exactly is the context," he asked quietly, "in which a man asks his sister to attend an engagement dinner, but not acknowledge that she is his sister?" Daniel's mouth opened. "Your Honor, it sounds worse than it is." That was his first mistake. Emily stared at him. "What message?" she asked. Mercer answered before he could. She read the words aloud exactly as they had appeared on my phone 3 days earlier. "You can come to the dinner, but please don't tell anyone you're my sister. Emily's parents are federal judges. It would be embarrassing." The effect of hearing those words in the open air of the dining room was immediate. Not explosive. Worse. People did not gasp. They simply stopped pretending not to listen. Emily's face went pale. "You told me she worked in administrative support for the Army," she said slowly. Daniel swallowed. "I was trying to keep things simple." Simple. Her voice was still quiet. But something had shifted behind it. Judge Carter leaned back slightly in his chair. "No," he said. Daniel turned toward him. "Sir, you were not trying to keep things simple," Carter continued calmly. "You were trying to avoid comparison." The sentence landed with surgical precision. Across the room, several guests looked down at their glasses. Daniel's shoulders dropped a fraction. "That's not fair," he said weakly. Carter gestured lightly toward me. "This woman has served her country in positions of real responsibility. Her work has been cited in legal discussions about civilian protection and command oversight." He paused. "And you seated her near the service door because you believed her existence would embarrass you." Daniel looked as if he had been struck. Emily turned toward him slowly. "Is that true?" she asked. He said nothing. That silence answered her question more clearly than anything else could have. Judge Carter's voice remained even. "A man who hides his own sister to appear more impressive," he said quietly, "is not a man I would trust with my daughter's future." The sentence ended the evening. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. Emily stared at the engagement ring on her hand for several seconds. Then she removed it. She placed it gently on the table beside Daniel's plate. The sound of the ring touching the glass surface was small. But in the silence of the room it sounded final. Daniel's face drained of color. "Emily, wait," he said urgently. She stepped back from him. "You didn't just lie to me," she said quietly. "You lied about the kind of person you are." Then she turned and walked toward the door beside her parents. Daniel's eyes followed her in stunned disbelief. For the first time in his life, the room was no longer bending around him. For a few seconds after Emily walked away, my brother did not move. He stood there staring at the empty chair she had left behind, as if the entire room had suddenly shifted into a language he did not understand. His hand was still resting on the back of the chair beside him, fingers tightening slowly against the polished wood. My mother was the first to speak. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said quickly. Her voice had lost the smooth confidence it carried earlier in the evening. Now it sounded thin, strained, the voice of someone trying desperately to glue together a story that had already shattered. "Daniel didn't mean it the way it sounded," she continued. "Families say things like that sometimes. It doesn't mean—" Colonel Mercer interrupted her with the same calm precision she used when correcting an officer during a briefing. "No," she said. "It means exactly what it says." My father looked at her sharply. "You've caused quite enough disruption here," he said. Mercer met his gaze without the slightest trace of apology. "I haven't caused anything," she replied. "I simply read the words your son sent." Judge Carter remained seated at my table, watching the entire exchange with the composed patience of someone who had presided over far more complicated confrontations in a courtroom. Daniel finally turned toward me. "Nora," he said. The sound of my name in his voice was almost strange. There was urgency in it now, a pleading edge that had never been there before. He crossed the room quickly and stopped beside my chair. "Can we talk outside for a minute?" he said quietly. The request was polite, private, controlled. It was also the same instinct he had always relied on whenever something threatened his carefully arranged image. Move the problem out of public view, contain the damage, convince the one person who could expose the truth to cooperate. For a second I studied his face. I had known this man my entire life. I had watched him charm teachers, employers, strangers, friends. I had watched him glide through rooms with the easy confidence of someone who believed admiration was a natural state of the world. And now for the first time I could see fear behind that confidence. Not fear because he understood what he had done. Fear because the room had stopped rewarding him for it. "No," I said. The word landed softly, but it carried clearly across the quiet dining room. Daniel blinked. "What?" "You were comfortable humiliating me in front of a room full of strangers," I said calmly. "You can hear my answer in front of them, too." Several people at nearby tables looked down quickly, suddenly fascinated by their glasses and plates. Wealthy rooms are very good at pretending not to witness things that make them uncomfortable. But no one left. Daniel flinched slightly. "That's not what I was doing," he said quickly. "I was just trying to control the story." Mercer finished for him. Judge Carter rose slowly from his chair. The movement was quiet but unmistakable. When he stood, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted with him. He looked first at Daniel, then at my parents, then finally at me. "I believe the evening has reached its natural conclusion," he said. His tone was not angry. It was simply final. He turned toward the door where his daughter had already disappeared and addressed one of the staff members standing near the wall. "Please inform my wife that we will be leaving." The server nodded and moved quickly down the corridor. My mother took a step forward. "Judge Carter, surely this doesn't have to end like this," she said. He regarded her calmly. "Mrs. Whitman," he replied, "a man who feels embarrassed by his sister's service has already explained quite a lot about himself." My father's jaw tightened. "You're making a decision based on one message." "No," Carter said quietly. "I'm making a decision based on character." The distinction settled over the room like a closing door. A moment later, Emily returned from the hallway, her coat draped over one arm. Her expression was composed now, though there was still a trace of hurt in her eyes. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at me. "I'm sorry," she said. The words were simple, but there was sincerity in them that my own family had never quite managed to offer. "You didn't deserve any of this," she added. I nodded once. "Thank you." Judge Carter placed a hand lightly on his daughter's shoulder. "We're ready," he said. The two of them walked toward the exit together, followed by Emily's mother. The door closed quietly behind them. The dinner was over, even though half the food had not yet been served. Even though dozens of guests still sat in their chairs. Even though the decorations, the flowers, the carefully printed place cards all remained exactly where they had been an hour earlier. My brother stood alone beside the empty table where his engagement had just ended. My mother sank slowly into a chair. My father looked down at the tablecloth as if the pattern in the fabric might provide some explanation for what had just happened. For several seconds no one spoke. Then Daniel said my name again. "Nora." The word was softer now. Almost childlike. I stood. Mercer rose beside me. I picked up my bag from the back of the chair and looked at my brother one last time. "There's nothing left to discuss," I said. "Not tonight. Not privately. Not after years of being useful only when I agreed to stay small." We walked toward the door together. I could feel the eyes of the entire room following us, but for the first time in my life that attention did not feel like judgment. It felt like correction. Outside, the night air was cold enough to clear the last heat from my face. Mercer waited until we reached the curb before speaking. "You all right?" she asked. I looked back through the tall windows of the dining room. Inside, my brother still stood exactly where I had left him, surrounded by the quiet ruins of the evening he had spent months planning. Then I turned away. "I am now," I said. The weeks that followed unfolded exactly the way rooms like that always do. Stories travel quickly through quiet circles of influence, not because people intend cruelty, but because character revealed in public has a way of becoming conversation. Daniel's engagement did not recover. His carefully built professional reputation began to fracture as well. Not dramatically at first, just small questions, quiet doubts, the kind that accumulate slowly until the image a person has been selling no longer feels trustworthy. My parents tried to repair the situation in the only way they knew how. They rewrote the story. My mother sent a long email about forgiveness and family unity. My father left several messages explaining that I had always been the stronger one and should know when to let things go. I read the first few sentences of the email. Then I deleted it. Because the truth had finally become simple. They did not want justice. They wanted access. They wanted the version of me who would quietly absorb humiliation so the rest of them could continue living without consequences. That version of me no longer existed. I changed my number, filtered their emails, and returned to the life I had built long before that dinner ever took place. Work continued. Responsibility continued. Months later, when a promotion opportunity opened that had been quietly building in the background of my career, the people making the decision did not ask what my family thought about it. They looked at my record. They looked at my judgment. They looked at the work itself. And that was enough. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not loud. It is simply standing in the truth long enough for everyone else to see who had value all along. If this story made you think about someone who deserves to be seen for who they really are, share it with them. And if you've ever had to walk away from people who only welcomed you when you agreed to stay small, I'd like to hear where you're watching from tonight. Leave a comment below and let me know your story. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told, so if you want to keep exploring them with me, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. We'll keep walking this road together.